All right, hello and welcome to round 4 of the US Amateur Team East. As we saw in the first 3 videos, we were entering this round with a team score of 2.5 out of 3, which wasn't too bad. Not what we were hoping for as one of the top seeds in the event. We were hoping to start with 3-0, of course, but 2.5 out of 3 is not a disaster either. It certainly, at least we hadn't dropped the match, and we were still very much in contention for top places. So this was a sort of critical point in the tournament where, similarly to round 3, we knew since we had stumbled early, we pretty much had to win every match by a very, very big score for our tiebreaks to stay competitive. Ideally 4-0, maybe 3.5 would be okay, but a very, very big score. And so we got sort of a favorable pairing for that, I would say, where we were playing against a team of strong seniors mostly. They had one younger player as well, but mostly seniors. And in particular, our individual matchup was against a exactly 2000 rated player, a player who has been on their floor for quite some time. So when you see these sorts of 2000, often 2000, sometimes 2100, 2200 older players, there's often this stereotype that they're probably not super active. They probably don't have a lot of theoretical opening knowledge. They're probably, they probably obviously just are past their prime. They were probably, at some point, because they have a floor, they were extremely strong, but that was some time ago. And nowadays, their strength is probably, or their rating probably hasn't caught up with their strength. And so it's very, very easy to underestimate this sort of player. But a lot of these players, I mean, they were always, sort of by definition, they were strong at some point. That strength never fully goes away. And so if they get their kind of position, like, they can still be very, very, very dangerous beasts. I've had many games in my career where I play against like a floor 2200, often the same floor 2200 because you sort of play the same people a lot as you're rising up the ranks. So there were several of these players that were on their floor for a very, very long time, and I played them several times at different rating stages of my career. And a lot of the time, when you play this person as a much lower rated player, it's great because you're playing somebody who maybe is your level, but because of the floor has a much higher rating. It's a great opportunity to get some rating. But as a higher rated player, it's actually quite scary because these are people who they can definitely beat you. And so I knew going into this game that this is certainly not like somebody to underestimate. Still a very, very good player, and actually does still play quite actively. I saw he had a lot of recent tournaments, and some of his performances really weren't that bad. So when you have these sorts of pairings, the opening selection again becomes very interesting, similar to round 3, but with a bit of difference because round 3 we were playing as a very young player. Now we're playing as a much older player, and so one approach to the game is to play something like super hyper aggressive, just try to blow them off the board, and basically make the gamble that they're probably not going to be super familiar with like the really hyper modern, like really aggressive stuff, because they probably can't be bothered to study theory, all that much. They probably have better things to do with their lives. They're playing for fun. They're perfectly happy to just like get a position and just like figure it out over the board. And that's definitely a very, very serious approach, is just try to flex your theoretical knowledge on them in a way that you probably couldn't do against like a similar strength active tournament player these days, because everyone's sort of expected to have at least some passing knowledge of the most aggressive tries in their opening. The other, which is what I chose to pursue in this game, is to just get a position. Basically say, okay, like, one of the weaknesses of a player of this sort of type, again, stereotyping, but one of the weaknesses of a player of this stereotype is that they'll struggle in longer games because, just a variety of reasons, may not actually hold their interest all that long. If it's kind of a boring dry position, Just longer games require a lot more mental stamina, which you expect as the younger player to have an advantage in. Um, all of these things where you're actually kind of okay with a long drawn out boring game. And so in this game, I sort of chose like a flexible option. I knew my opponent was going to play the Caro. He's mostly played it throughout his entire career, especially recently. And so I decided to go for this very, very trendy, topical idea with D3, which is sort of a mix of all three of these ideas. On the one hand, we're trying to flex our theoretical knowledge because this is something that we probably don't expect our opponent to be super familiar with. It's a line that's only been developed within the last, like, 5 or 6 years. And so, he's probably seen it before by now, at least in passing, but it's probably not something that he's seriously analyzed at some point. It does have the option of getting very, very aggressive. If black goes for bishop g4, white will often go ahead and like really try to steamroll the opponent on the king side. So you can very easily get into some very, very complex aggressive struggles. But also, if they go ahead and go for this endgame, which is what my opponent ended up doing, you get this very long drawn out, like pressing a slight advantage sort of position that oftentimes these sorts of players have difficulty dealing with because it's just very, very unpleasant. It takes a lot of, not only mental stamina, but sort of, it takes a very specific kind of mood to be willing to defend such a kind of position. And even title players struggle with this quite a lot. So I was hoping he wouldn't go for this endgame, honestly, because it is pleasant for white, but oftentimes it is not a lot. But I was okay with it if he did. And so in this game, he did choose to go for this endgame, which was not my ideal case, but fine. So if you're seeing this for the first time, you might wonder, okay, why are we doing this? It seems very weird in principle to allow, it's extremely rare that you actually want to allow your opponent to exchange queens on the d file in a way that forces you to move your king. It's kind of rare as the white pieces that you want to allow the exchange of queens on the d file at all. In fact, black will often allow the exchange of white to take on d8 and take back with the king, sort of conceding that it's a disadvantage to take with the king, but arguing, okay, I have the black pieces, like, fine, you get a slight advantage, I'm just going to sit here and hold. So is that what we're doing? Or, are we taking the white pieces and on move 4 saying, okay, I'm going to be slightly worse, but I'm going to hold a draw? Like, no, of course not. That's not what we're doing. White does have some advantages in exchange for the somewhat compromised position of the king, which, it should be noted is not really that unsafe. It's not like black is going to somehow like start a vicious attack in the center against this uncastled king without the queens on the board. But white's advantages lie twofold. One, white has much better control of the center because, our pawn's on e4 and black's is on c6. So the c6 is like sort of a waste of a move. In a sense, we're also just one tempo ahead in development because we have the white pieces. We're always one tempo ahead in development. And the second is this pawn on c6 is actually very unpleasant for black because it really gets in the way. The knight can no longer develop to c6, which means it pretty much has to go to d7 at some point. There's no other square that it can go to. That raises the question of where this knight should go, because the knight will eventually go to f6, but it's not really going to do anything there. It's going to be very well corralled by white's structure, and so often black would actually like to put this knight on d7 to eventually route to c5, maybe to b6 and c4. And so both of these knights are trying to occupy the same square in d7. Only one of them can go there. And so oftentimes black gets a very, very cramped position where all of his pieces sort of want to be in the same place, which is very awkward. And so that makes this next move that black played, bishop to g4, very natural, because black is basically trying to have less pieces on the board. It's sort of the maxim that I was talking about in round 3. If you have less space, which black essentially is going to have less space for most of the game, then you actually want fewer pieces on the board. And so it's unusual. It's slightly surprising, perhaps, that this bishop g4 move is actually a very, very serious strategic mistake. The reason being that this bishop is actually going to be black's good bishop. And if black does eventually play the move knight to d7, let's say immediately, for example, white plays, I don't know, let's say bishop e3, black is eventually going to play the move e5. It's kind of mandatory in order to develop the pieces. The other way of developing is g6, but that's considerably worse because the bishop will be staring at a very, very solid pawn structure that limits it substantially. So this pawn is probably eventually going to move to e5. At that point, these pawns on e4 and e5 will be cemented basically forever. It would be very, very surprising if either of those pawns ever move. And so that means that, in general, as a general principle, you don't want a pawn on the same color as your bishop because it restricts the movement of it. And so with the pawns on e4 and e5, white would actually not like to have the light square bishops on the board because it'll get stuck against the e4 pawn. And black would not like to have the dark square bishops on the board because it gets stuck against the e5 pawn. So by playing bishop to g4, after white plays bishop to e2, and this knight moves away and the bishops are traded, white is actually the one that's very, very happy with this exchange because the light square bishops are now off the board. Even though that is one less piece that black has to deal with, the structural advantage that white gains is the fact that the dark square bishops are on the board, and it's not really clear where this bishop is going to find a home. A very typical setup for white involves c3, b4, and a5, in which case this bishop is never really going to fit onto this diagonal, and if it stays on either e7 or d6, it will be very, very passive, because again, it'll be heavily limited by this e5 pawn. So after bishop g4, I played the move bishop to e2. My opponent played knight d7, which is very sensible. Also another reason that you would sort of lean towards bishop g4, because if you played knight d7 immediately, this bishop would be stuck on c8 for some time. And now here, white has an option of how to try to trade this bishop off. The main move is knight to e1, which is kind of a funny looking move, you know, bringing the knight all the way back to the room. We violated a lot of what seemed to be concrete opening principles, but white is just trying to exchange the bishops, and the idea is that after takes, this knight will come to d3, where it will be very well placed, putting pressure against the e5 pawn that will eventually have to land there. The other knight will be able to come to c4, for example, where it will also put pressure against the e5 pawn that will eventually arrive. White will expand on the queen side with the setup that we talked about before, c3, b4, and a4, a5. White will have a very, very comfortable position. The other option for white is to play the move knight to d2, which is a very funny looking move, but is also the move that we would play after, if black played knight f6, we would have to play the move knight to d2 to defend the e4 pawn, while also offering the exchange of bishops. So knight fd2 in this position is a little bit logical for the same reason. We cement the e4 pawn in case of knight f6. This knight is preparing to go to c4, where it will be sort of joined by the other knight also going to c4, either through a3 or d2. And so this is the move that I have been experimenting with recently online. It's the move that I chose to try in this game. So now after black takes, for example, e5, white can probably play a4 first to try to cement the square for the knight. And after some sensible moves, for example, bishop e7, knight c4, white is a very, very, very comfortable position. The bishop will come to e3. The knight will, again, maybe knight a3, knight c4, maybe knight d2, knight c4. Maybe the knight can go to c3. And after a5, go to a4, maybe c5. There's a lot of ideas for white. And black's knights, again, are completely stuck. This knight would like to go to d7, but it can't, because there's already a knight there. This knight can never move because it's needed to defend this pawn. And this bishop is never really getting to c5 because it'll just be harassed off of the diagonal by c3, b4, and a5. And even if black does get the bishop here, it'll eventually be traded off, and white's knights will be just way better than their counterparts. Plus this king that, you know, has been weakened by moving to d1 is now actually extremely well placed. It's fully centralized in the endgame, it's completely safe, and very well poised for any kind of action in the center. So in this position, my opponent played Novelty. Actually, I don't think it's ever been played before, but it's computer approved. It is the best move, which I was shocked to see. But my opponent played this very ugly looking move, bishop to e6, which turns out to be a very, very sensible idea. Black is simply saying, actually, good point. You know, I don't want to trade the light square bishops. I'm just going to not trade them. I'm going to go back here. And black is saying, okay, sure, like I prevented myself from playing e5, but that's temporary. You know, this bishop, maybe black will play like f6, bishop f7, and then e5. Maybe black will play f5. Maybe black will play g6 and bishop g7 and just leave the pawn on e7. You know, the bishop is not actually that poorly placed here. This is a good diagonal for it. It puts some pressure on c4, which is where white's knight would like to go. It defends some squares like, you know, f5 if white eventually plays some maneuver like this. It's certainly a very reasonable idea, and one that the computer actually does approve of and thinks is not only viable but actually the best move in the position. So at this point I was on my own. I had never seen this bishop e6 move before. I eventually decided to play the move a4 first. This is the same idea as I was talking about before. We would like to put the knight on c4, but cementing the position, not allowing b5, which would try to or aim at least at harassing the knight off of there. And here my opponent played the move f5, trying to put immediate pressure on the center and prepare to develop the knight to f6 in a way that puts more pressure on e4, but also doesn't interfere with the rest of the development. If black were to play this immediately, now there is no f6 move for this bishop to slide back. Whereas after f5, if black does play knight f6 and then maybe takes on e4, then bishop f7 and e5 is quite possible. So this is presumably black's plan. I'm going to move knight c3, black played knight f6. Now I spent some time thinking here because, your first instinct might be, okay, well, I'm just going to take and give black an isolated pawn. Like, how can white not be better here? You know, white has extremely good control over the square that's going to be in front of the isolated pawn. White has a lot of options of how to continue to put pressure on the pawn directly. But the problem is that now white's king actually is uncomfortable here. There isn't a great way to get this rook into the game. The king on the d-file is kind of relevant, because if we play like knight c4, for example, castle queenside, now there is a sort of kind of unpleasant threat of stuff coming down the d-file. It's a position that, you know, really isn't that easy for white to manage. And even if we do get, you know, some kind of stable situation where we blockade the isolated pawn, it's not actually that much better for white a lot of the time. You know, you do get the advantage of this isolated pawn, but it by itself usually isn't enough to win the game. You need to come up with some sort of second idea on some other side of the board, and that's really not easy to create, especially with so many pieces still on the board. The queens have been traded, but every other piece is still there. So I definitely didn't really want to take on f5, but at the same time I couldn't see anything better, because, you know, I do need to develop the queen side at some point. I want to play the move knight to c4, develop this bishop, maybe move the king out of the way, do something with this rook. I was thinking of ideas like a5 and rook a4, trying to get into the game from the side. A lot of stuff along these lines. And so eventually I did decide to take on f5, but I certainly wasn't happy about it. My opponent simply took back, of course, and then this was the point, was to be able to play the move knight to c4. Now, one idea I had was that if black castles, yes, it looks very scary that there's this sort of annoying discovered attack coming down the d-file, but there's no immediate threat. And so if I just play the move bishop to e3, first of all, I'm attacking a7, so, you know, there is, which is a very serious threat. I mean, I am just threatening to take a pawn. None of these discoveries are super concerning. White can simply slide the king out of the way, and after like takes, you know, black hasn't really accomplished anything. We're still threatening this. We've gotten a piece off the board. Now it starts to feel like the isolated pawn is quite relevant. So my opponent instead chose to continue development with e5, which makes a lot of sense. And after bishop e3, the point is now, we're not threatening anything on a7. There's no immediate problem for black, and so black doesn't have to do something strange like castle and queenside, and instead has a move to centralize the knight with knight to d5. It's a very powerful move. Now, of course, if white takes, black has a pristine center, and is probably just winning in this position. This looks pretty over, to be honest. The knight is kicked off of its very, very beautiful square on c4 and really has nowhere to go. If we go to a5, which is something that we could also do here. Part of my idea in this was that, okay, at some point I'll play knight to a5 and put pressure on both of these pawns. Then especially when the bishop's already on e3, which prevents rook b8 because we can take on a7. There's not actually a great way to defend this pawn. But what I realized in this position was that this idea fails tactically to the idea of bishop b4. And now if we do go ahead and take on b7, the knight is simply stranded here and actually can immediately get collected, but black doesn't even have to do that. Black can go sort of take this knight whenever he wants. He could just castle, for example, here. So we don't have that idea. So there's no knight a5, there's no knight takes d5 or anything. And so eventually I came up with what I thought was a good move, king to c1. And so I think this game, what this game sort of highlights is the balance between dynamic and static advantage, and how comfortable you have to be transitioning between the two. White does have a very clear static advantage. Well, I guess I should clarify what I mean by dynamic versus static advantage first. Generally speaking, a static advantage is something that's permanent, something inherent to the structure of the position. And so you can think of it as like, if both sides got to put their pieces like wherever they want, within reason, like they get to put all their pieces on their ideal squares, who has the advantage and why? And in this case, it's very clear. If white got to put like his rooks on d1 and e1, and then blockade this pawn very comfortably, put a knight on e4, bring this bishop to like b2 or something with b3, and put pressure on this pawn, white is very clearly the one playing for victory with this isolated pawn. So this isolated pawn is what we call a static advantage. It's something that you can never get rid of unless white helps. Like if I took, then that would get rid of this advantage. But as long as white isn't helping, then black can't get rid of it on his own. And by contrast, a dynamic advantage is something temporary. It's like an attack on the king, or like an attack on like a lead in development, more active pieces. Like these are things that are ephemeral. If they can dissipate without your opponent having to assist you along the way. And so in this position, white has a static advantage in this isolated pawn that's compensated by a bit of a dynamic advantage with a better king and slightly more active pieces. But white is offering black the chance to destroy white's structure, in which case black obtains a static advantage. Maybe you can say these static advantages even balance out, but white is in return getting a very dynamic advantage with this severe pressure down the B and D files. Suddenly his king is actually kind of chilling. Like this rook on A1 is suddenly very, very well placed because it's going to come to the B file. This rook is going to come to the D file, and this king is actually kind of perfectly sandwiched between them. And now suddenly it's actually white that has an advantage in development with more active pieces. This knight is better than its counterpart. This bishop is, I guess kind of about the same as its counterpart. Neither of them are really doing much. This bishop is better than its counterpart, and the rooks are about to be better than their counterparts as well. So, this is how like sort of a static advantage can evolve into a dynamic one very quickly. And conversely, black's dynamic advantage here can sort of liquidate into a static one if he so chooses. But in this case, I think it's simply bad. So in this position, my opponent went with the move bishop to b4, trying to take, again, advantage of the activity of the pieces. But we once again come up with a way to try to press our own dynamic, or sort of offer the option of giving us a dynamic advantage with the move rook to d1. which I was very, at this point, like having found this move, now I started to get a little bit more confident. I was happy to see this move bishop b4. And I think because of this move, bishop b4 is actually a pretty significant mistake. I think black should actually take on e3, not on c3. And after knight e3, just drop the bishop back to g6. The reason for this is, now it's black that's the one that's playing with a dynamic advantage. The two bishops are going to have a severe initiative that rule over the board. This static disadvantage of the isolated pawn is not so relevant. White may be able to erect some kind of blockade on the e4 square, but it's going to be very, very difficult to do that while simultaneously putting pressure on the e5 pawn directly. And again, we still have a complete mess on the queen side that we have to untangle, which is very, very difficult. I actually think in this position, black is probably better. Or I would prefer to have the black pieces here. And so I was very, very worried somewhere around here. Or in this position, I was very, very worried that I was going to fall into even a disadvantage and have to defend. But after bishop b4, I started to feel like, okay, like he's missed rook d1. Now I should be okay. So what's the point of rook d1? I mean, bishop b4 was obviously aimed at attacking this c3 knight twice. And there's kind of a couple points. One is that, first of all, if black is distracted by moving this bishop off of this diagonal, then knight d6 becomes a very, very powerful fork between the king and the bishop. But even if that wasn't the case, the second would be that, again, we have the B and D files to work with. And so at the cost of a pawn, we've managed to activate this rook on e1, so we've resolved the queen side entirely. We've drawn this bishop to a square that it doesn't really do anything. It has sort of no route back into the game. It's actually sort of in serious danger of being trapped. And it's not contributing at all to the defense of either the king or the queen side, which are both under very, very serious fire very quickly. And so even if we played rook b1 here, I didn't really calculate this all that hard, to be honest. Knight d6 is one option, and then maybe even taking the piece. For example, king f8, we can actually just take on d7. White has a big material advantage, and also the rooks are useless. So white is probably actually just going to checkmate black. But after king d8, white can even consider giving away the exchange here, maybe like bishop g4, putting pressure on this piece. White can play knight f7, going after this rook. We could take up b7. We could play rook b1 here as well. There's just too many threats for black to deal with. And so black is not tactically able to take on c3, even if he wanted to, but even if there was no tactical justification, like immediate tactical justification that like wins a piece, I think white would stand very, very well if black actually did accept this sort of pseudo pawn sacrifice. And so instead my opponent did end up taking on e3, but I think a move late, because now after takes, if black goes to g6, which is still a better move, there's this very, very unpleasant threat on d7, which makes it very difficult for black to castle, even though there's no immediate impact on the knight. Probably I would have played the move a5 here, again intending rook a4, trying to bring the rook in from the side. If black took on c3, that's generally fine. Again, we'd break the structure, but we'd obtain a lot of dynamic advantage in exchange. But it was still quite a bit better than the move he chose, which looks a bit more solid because it defends the knight. And this bishop sort of really keeps this knight under control. It's like this is a very common setup where a bishop is dominating a knight. But more importantly, it allows this knight to come to e4, and now this knight becomes a very, very, very powerful piece. A big threat already is knight to g5, really harassing this bishop, and black needs to do something about that immediately. Or this situation can get very, very bad very quickly. For example, if black castles, then after knight g5, white is pretty much just winning. This bishop is needed to defend the knight, but also is under attack itself, so the bishop can't move away. And after knight to c5, takes, bishop c4, hitting the knight. Black is forced to defend this with the rook. And then I mean a lot of moves are kind of crushing here. Probably like C, even just something simple like C3, sort of asking this bishop where it's going, but knight g4 is maybe one of the most to the point, where this pawn is simply indefensible because the rook is distracted with the knight. The knight can't move away. So in this position, my opponent spent quite a bit of time and eventually played the move bishop to e7, which is objectively a mistake, but it was the move I was expecting. Just trying to defend the g5 square, and it's not like the bishop's really doing anything on b4 anyway. I think most likely my opponent instead had to play the move knight f6, but this looks very unpleasant visually, where black is sort of acknowledging that something has gone wrong and is going to face a very, very unpleasant defense with this this isolated pawn under very, very heavy pressure now. Now the advantage of the static advantage of the isolated pawn is very, very real, with a lot of pieces coming off the board. So my opponent played bishop e7. Pretty quickly played the move bishop to c4. Again, this is sort of a similar idea to game 3. We're trading off black's best piece. And in this case, there's also a more concrete point that we're putting pressure on d7, which is preventing black from castling. For example, after takes, white is threatening to play knight d6, which, among other things, wins the pawn on b7, but also just a great position for the knight. And black is not able to castle because the knight on d7 would be left undefended. So in this position, black has basically two ways to continue. One is to take anyway, and then defend this pawn somehow, either by rook b8 or castle queenside or b6, some move like this, maybe knight c5. But most likely white will end up picking up either the e4 or the b7 pawns, maybe even both in some lines. This rook is going to enter the game from the side, so this sort of very temporary advantage that black has of this knight being out of the game is also not serious. And white has tactical ideas of, for example, after b6, takes, king e7, white is able to just go grab this g7 pawn very comfortably. So white is pretty much winning a pawn in that line, and after knight f8, trying to defend the bishop, takes, knight to c4. Once again, white is threatening knight d6, which will pick up the b7 pawn, but white is also threatening to take on e5 directly. Black is at least able to castle and give away this pawn in, like, not too violent a manner. You know, it is a very clear pawn, but at least the position hasn't also collapsed around it, and so I think this is probably one of black's better defenses, if not the best one. But white is, I mean, it is a pawn. White should probably win here with proper technique. And it's not that easy to defend either, because, you know, rook d7 is coming. It's not really clear what black's defensive setup should be. And so in this position, my opponent spent a very, very long time trying to decide between the two choices of bishop takes c4 and knight f8. I think it's a very, very difficult choice to evaluate on concrete grounds. It's definitely just sort of a matter of intuition and taste of which kind of position you'd prefer to defend. And after thinking for 30, 40, 45 minutes, like most of his remaining time, he unfortunately played the move b6, which is neither of those two defenses, and resigned before waiting for me to take the bishop. Presumably he was intending to play takes in b6 and just simply mixed up the move order when he went to play it. But he wasn't particularly upset after the game, because I think he felt at this point the position was already very, very close to losing, if not simply lost. So we ended up winning this game. This was a very comfortable win, probably obviously my shortest of the event at just 17 moves. But not a very satisfying one, I gotta say. Like, the opening experiment was kind of a failure. My opponent basically refuted the concept over the board, got a better position with the black pieces, and so, you know, not a lot to be particularly proud of. But we got the job done in the end. This was another match that we ended up winning by a 4-0 score. Again, not like super unexpected, just based on, you know, on paper ratings, but always good to get the job done. And so we were heading into round 5 with, having given up the draw in round 2 was not ideal, but we did do our job in the other rounds, and 4-0'd every match other than that. So at this point, we were feeling reasonably okay. We had still decent tie breaks if we managed to make it to 5.5, so we were still very much competing for probably not first. You definitely need a perfect score these days to win the tournament, but for like the top, like, I don't know, 5 places, we were probably still very much alive. And so this set up like a very, very critical round 5. We knew that was going to be the one of the deciding, or well, a critical final day. I mean, there's only 2 rounds left, but round 5 is definitely one of the make or break moments, because first of all, you have to win the match. That is a match you inarguably have to win. And second of all, it's a match where we have the black pieces, which for us is a severe disadvantage. So if we could get through that, if we could get through that one, then we'd at least have a fighting chance in the final round. And so, we ended the day reasonably confident. I was still like okay with the way I played. My teammates were okay with the way they played. Round 5 was shaping up to be the real test here. So more on the next time. Thank you for watching, and I will see you all for round 5 of the US Amateur Team East.